Good morning, everybody. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel to Chronicles study, but we're going to be a little different today because we are actually now in face-to-face in the building. So it's going to be a little different than what we've done before when you're just watching this on YouTube, although it kind of be a little the same, but some of it's going to be a little different. Hopefully you'll be able to hear people when they make comments and be able to follow along with us. Before we get started, though, we want to have a prayer, and so since Chad's real close, we're going to have Chad lead us in that prayer, if you would, and then we'll get started.
Dear Father in heaven, thank you for waking us up this morning and bringing us here to hear a portion of your word presented by Mike. We ask that you be with us as hearers as we take in that information and learn from it. We're so thankful for your son, Jesus. Be with us this day and bless us, forgive us our sins. In your son's name, amen.
Amen. All right, well, what we were going to do, and by the way, if you will close those doors so that people who are walking in won't bother us as they walk in. Yeah, better close those doors of the auditorium, please. Because I know people are going to be coming in and stuff, especially about 10 o'clock, because they'll be thinking worship service is starting. But we are in our new schedule. We meet at 9:30 for Bible class now and 10:30 for worship. And so hopefully you remembered that and you weren't tricked on being here. You actually meant to be here. And so we're looking at Samuel and Chronicle study, although since we're meeting in the building now and we're just finishing up 2 Samuel, we might start a different subject if you guys like, or a different book, or we can continue on with this and we'll discuss that a little bit later. But just so everybody knows. So I gave you a couple of handouts, and if you take a look at those handouts, you notice that there's 1 Samuel. I just want to kind of bring you up to speed, those of you that haven't been able to watch this online, but you're here in person. I want you to notice that we were covering 1 Samuel, and 1 Samuel is the prophet, and he's the prophet that really went from being prophet to judge. And so if you look at our chart up here, or our line that I always put up here, here's the judges period right here. And so between the judges period and the kingdom, that's Saul. I mean, that's Samuel. Samuel would be right in here in that period there. He's bridging the gap between the judges and the kings. And so that's who Samuel is, because he's going to introduce the first king for us. And he introduces Saul, who is the first king. And so I'm just bringing you up to speed here on your 1 Samuel little outline. Saul was the first king, but of course he was rejected because he didn't remain faithful to God. And so therefore God picked David to be the next king. And however, Saul didn't give up his rule or his reign until he actually died at the end of 1 Samuel. And so between chapter 16 and chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, you have Saul basically trying to kill David, and David hiding and running and doing all those stories that we hear about him when he's in the Philistine group and when he's living in the caves and deserts and in the forest because Saul is out to kill him, and God delivered him. And so it's that section that where you look at in 1 Samuel. So that's 1 Samuel. Then if you flip the page over, you should have 2 Samuel. And 2 Samuel then picks up when David becomes king. But for the first 7 years, David is only king in Hebron. For about 7.5 years, if you take a look at that little outline, and he reigns in Hebron. So the kingdom wasn't quite united yet. There were still some people that were following Saul. And so you have the stories, you have the story in this section of how Saul's rebellious family finally submitted to David, and David then became king over them. And so then he rules in Jerusalem, beginning in chapter 5. So in chapter 5, he reigns over all of Israel and is king over all of Israel. And as a result of that, as you notice in the kind of the big section in this outline here, David's triumphs. And so you see the arrow going up, and the arrow goes up to chapter 11. And then in chapter 11, you have David's sin. And who remembers what that sin is of David? Everybody remembers, right? Bathsheba, right? And the killing of her husband and all of that, and trying to hide it. And Nathan saying, "You're the man." And David saying that he did it and he's sorry he did and God forgave him. But as a result of that, God said your family is always going to have trouble. There's going to be trouble in your family. And so we notice that the line of David's successes now goes down on the chart. And the reason it goes down is not because David isn't king, but because David's troubles mount and mount, and they get worse and worse. And so one of the things that tells us is that what we're reading about and what we're looking at as we look at this last section is we're looking at those problems that God said David was going to have as a result of his sin. Now, because many of you haven't been in our class, and I don't know how many of you listen to it online, I want you to understand that this is also true in our life, that you're gonna understand that if you do what God says, your life is pretty much going to be okay unless you're being persecuted outside by individuals who don't like God. But your life is generally going to be okay. You're not going to have too many problems or difficulties. But what happens is if we have major sin in our life, and this might even be before you become a Christian, if we have major sin in our life, then what we find out is that as we develop our children, that we have tendencies of being lax in those areas that we had problems with, and we become lax in those areas. So, for example, if you weren't very physically faithful to God when you were single and you ran around a lot, then when your children start dating, you're probably not going to be real persuasive in having them live a pure life, because you're going to feel guilty about doing it, because you're going to say, well, I didn't do it. And so, it's kind of hypocritical for me to tell them to do it. And so it becomes real difficult. And that's one of the problems with sin. Sin does that in our life. It causes us to be weak. Bless you. It causes us to be a little bit weak and a little bit timid in those areas where we should probably be a little bit stronger. Because, of course, the only person we know of that never sinned and always treats people properly is Jesus. So remember that if you have problems or difficulties in your family, as you look at your life, consider that some of that might just be because of our spiritual upbringing and some of the areas where we failed. And so we don't really expect it of our kids because we failed, and we don't want, we feel bad about doing that. And so I'd suggest to you that's what you have in here is you have all these problems with David's family is because David had a hard time correcting his family. One of the things that happened is Amnon was raped. His daughter was raped by one of his sons. And rather than David doing what the law says, which is that his son should have been killed, should have suffered some judgment, he basically just yelled at him and got mad at him, but didn't really do anything and didn't really cause him to suffer any consequences. And of course, in our world today, in our culture, it seems like everybody's trying to avoid consequences for their kids and consequences on playgrounds. And so they take away the monkey bars and they take away the swing sets and they take away everything because a kid might hurt himself, and they don't have all these consequences. You can't play dodgeball because you might get hit in the face, and you don't want to play sports because the ball might hit you. And what they're doing is they're simply taking away all the consequences as a result. And so that's part of this problem that David has. He's not very good at administering consequences, but God is. And God is administering these consequences to David, and that's why his family's having a problem. And then after that, Absalom kills his half-brother who raped his full sister. And so he ends up killing him a little bit later. And so that's in David's family. And David, and Absalom runs off. And then eventually David brings back Absalom. You can believe it. Brings him back into the family. And then Absalom rebels against David and basically overthrows David. And one of the things that God said was going to happen to David when David had slept with Bathsheba is God said that you did it secretly, but I'm going to do it publicly with you. I'm going to have in a public way, your wife is, somebody's going to take advantage of your wife. And so when Absalom became king, they set up this tent in the palace, and David had left his concubines there, and Absalom went into the concubines. And so what David had done in secret, God did publicly. And one of the things we need to remember is God is always going to find out our sin. If we think we can hide our sin from God, it's not. And it's going to result in consequences, and sometimes they're public consequences that people see, and therefore affects our standing with individuals. So as a result of that, then there was a war between Absalom and David had been run out of Jerusalem. And so David had to then have a fight with Absalom and his army. And when that happened, then there was a whole bunch of other stuff that happened. And as a result of that, then David won the battle. Absalom was killed. And David then again becomes king. And so that's where we're at down here at about chapter 21. Now you notice on this chart that it says from chapters 21 to 24 is an appendix. And we're going to notice some of that appendix. And the reason it says it's an appendix is because up to this time, pretty much things have been in kind of chronological order. But we're going to get to this section, this isn't in chronological order. And I'll suggest to you some reasons why when we get there. Then the next chart that you have, I want you to notice, is 1 Chronicles, because 1 Chronicles deals with 1 and 2 Samuel. And so 1 Chronicles is basically the same thing as 1 and 2 Samuel with a couple of additions. And so when we need to look at those additions, we do, but we basically are looking at 1 and 2 Samuel. And so we're actually covering 1 Chronicles with that as we're covering that. And the only difference is that in 1 Chronicles, you had this in chapters 1 through 11, you had a big section that dealt with genealogies. And then you began the story of David and his kingdom. And so that's kind of where we're at over here in the story of David when it comes to 1 Chronicles. Now, the other thing I want you to remember is that this period of Saul and David is what we call the United Kingdom period. On our chart that I put up here on the board all the time, it's this little section right here. Right here, this is the United Kingdom. That's what we're looking at in there. If you notice after Solomon's rule, then it becomes divided. That's this section here. So those are the kings that are going to be in these sections when we get into, if we continue going through the historical books, we're going to get into the kings, and we're going to get into division between Israel and Judah, but these are the kings. And so when we get ready to look at them, we look at those kings so that we can make some sense out of them, because I know sometimes those are pretty difficult. But if you notice, there was Saul and David, and we're in the middle of David's rule, or kind of towards the end of David's rule, and we're going to get into Solomon and his rule if we follow on into 1 and 2 Kings. And so hopefully that brought you up a little bit to speed that we're looking at. And so we're over here in 2 Samuel chapter 22, but I want to look at chapter 21 for just a minute, and then get you to think about a couple of things down here. Now, actually, it's my mistake. Yeah, we're in chapter 21. Let me go to chapter 20. Sorry. In chapter 20, down at the end, well, if you look in your Bibles in chapter 20, it probably says something like the rebellion of Sheba. And that's when David came back after defeating Absalom, that some of the people of Israel decided not to follow David. They followed this guy named Sheba. And so then David has to have a little civil war, you might say, but it doesn't last very long. And finally, David then takes control of the kingdom. And that's what you have down here, beginning at about verse 23, towards the end of 2 Samuel 20, 23 through 26. You have a bunch of names there. He talks about who's over the army. He talks about who's over the forced labor. He talks about who the recorder is. He talks about who the priests are. And you might say, well, why is that in there? Well, what that's telling us is David is again putting up his cabinet, as we often refer to when we get a new president, they install their cabinet. So it's showing us that he's restoring his kingdom. He's restoring his cabinet. He's putting it back in place. Now then, beginning with chapter 21, we have this kind of appendix. And the reason I'm telling you that is because we're not sure exactly where it is that this happened in the life of David. There's no real reference to when it actually happened, but these events happened. And so the writer of 2 Samuel thought it important enough to put at least in the appendix at the end of the book, where he was going to be talking about some of the things that were kind of just left unsaid as he went through the story of telling us the story of David, because the purpose for 1st and 2nd Samuel is basically to tell us about the king and how the kingdom came and how David became king and what's happening in David's life. And so then you have this section here that's kind of a strange little section if you look at it. And so let's start reading in 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 1. Anybody want to mention anything or say anything before we move on? All right, so chapter 21 verse 1 says, now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the presence of the Lord. And the Lord said, it is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. And the sons of Israel made a covenant with them. But Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So let me tell you what's going on if you don't remember. During the time that the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, and they were going to come in and conquer the land of Canaan. So this is way back over here. This is some 400 or 500 years earlier, that when they entered the land, they were supposed to do what with the people? They're supposed to kill every one of them, right? But there was this group of Gibeonites. Remember the story of the Gibeonites? What did the Gibeonites do? Well, the Gibeonites deceived them, but the Gibeonites basically tricked them into thinking that the Gibeonite people lived in a different location outside of Israel. And so they were coming to make a covenant with the children of Israel, and Joshua made a covenant with them. And when they made a covenant, that means that Joshua had to protect them and they had to protect Joshua. They're making a covenant together. And so, of course, God was a little upset because they didn't ask God, first of all, but they did it. And they swore in the name of the Lord. So now they have to keep it. So the Gibeonites lived in the land during all this time, and they were the wood haulers and water carriers. That's who they were. And so whenever the Gibeonites were under attack, Israel was supposed to take care of them and was supposed to help them because they have that covenant. But as you notice here, it says that there was a famine in the land. So there is a consequence to not keeping covenants and not keeping our promises, especially in a national way. He says, and there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the presence of the Lord. So David went and talked to God about it and wanted to know what was going on. And that's certainly something we should always do. If we're having problems in our life, the first thing we should do is ask God, why am I having these problems? You know, what am I doing wrong? Is it something I'm doing, or is it just circumstances? And so David went in and asked God and talked with God. And remember that during that time, there were the priests that had the Urim and the Thummim, and the priest could talk with God, and God would talk to the people through the Urim and the Thummim, and they had prophets also. And so he went and talked to God, and God said, or the Lord said, it is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So apparently Saul, who wasn't very faithful to God, was what I think is going on is Saul probably wasn't doing real well. And so he's maybe trying to figure out a way to get in God's good graces. And since the Gibeonites were originally Canaanites, he sought to put them to death. He sought to destroy them, kind of like making up for the fact that they made a covenant with him that they really weren't supposed to. And so I kind of suspect that that's what's happening. Now, what I want you to notice, it says, it is for Saul and his bloody house. So it wasn't just Saul himself that was doing this. Maybe Saul, as a result of his thinking, or as a result of him not thinking properly, he taught his house to not like or to hate the Gibeonites. And by the way, that sometimes happens in our culture. Maybe you're of a certain race and you have a certain attitude towards a different race, and that attitude wears off on your children. Or maybe you have an attitude towards rich people or poor people, or you know, small people or fat people or skinny people or men or women. And the attitude you have is going to wear off on your children. And so your children are probably going to have the same kind of attitudes that you have and you displayed. And certainly we understand that when it comes to like family abuse and alcoholism and those kind of things. You see that generationally following, you know, a family because it just keeps going because the children learn how to do that. And so that's probably what's going on here. So, and the reason I tell you that is because God has a command, and one of God's commandments is that the children are not to be put to death for the crimes of the parents. And yet you're going to notice something rather strange that goes on here. So I wanted to preface that with getting you to understand that this isn't just against Saul. This is also against Saul's house. It's also against those people who were under Saul, who carried out Saul's commands and willingly did what Saul wanted them to do. And so God said that Saul and his family had been killing the Gibeonites. Now verse 2 says, so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now, the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Remember that they were part of the people that were supposed to be executed when they entered the land of Canaan. And he says, and the sons of Israel made a covenant with them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So Saul was doing this as a result of his zeal for Judah and Israel, and probably that means the purity of the nation, the purity of the people. And so he was getting rid of them. Now, that's actually a good thing. It's actually a good thing to get rid of whatever in your house is going to cause you to sin and stumble. That's actually a good thing. And here, of course, we're talking about people. And so if you have people in your lives that, aren't the best people and they're tempting you to sin, certainly you want to try to avoid them. But in this case, God had said, now you got to take care of these people. It's kind of like if you get married before you're a Christian and you marry somebody who's kind of worldly, because that's the way you were before you're a Christian. After you get married, you're not allowed to take that worldly person and throw them out. You now have to take care of them. You have to love them. You have to do what's right for them. Well, why? They're worldly, because you made a covenant with them. You made a covenant to love them, to take care of them. And so that's kind of the same thing that we have going on here. And so even though Saul might have been intending a good reason, the fact is he went against what God actually said. And I have known people that have divorced their wives because their wives or their husbands were worldly when they married them. They became Christians. They said it'd be better if I marry a Christian. Well, they broke the covenant that they made. And so that covenant is something that's going to be supposed to be kept. So we're supposed to keep our covenants with individuals. And here's an example of that. All right. So anyway, so hopefully that helps us as we get into this section. Verse 3 says, and thus David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And how can I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And then the Gibeonites said to him, we have no concern of silver or gold with Saul or his house, nor is it for us to put any man to death in Israel. And he said, I will do for you whatever you say. So they said to the king, the man who consumed us and who planned to exterminate us from remaining within any border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. And so basically, he goes and he asks the Gibeonites, what do you want? Now, here's another thing to remember. It is not the offender who gets to decide how to make things right with the offended. Why do I say that? Because, Pedro, you can't bring your wife a fishing pole and think she'll be happy when she's mad at you. Lourdes has to tell you what it is she wants when she's mad at you in order for you to get back in her good graces. And by the way, I have no idea if you have a problem. I'm just saying it's just an example. But we all understand that, okay? As husbands, we understand it's not when we did something to our wives and they're mad at us, it's not our job to just give them whatever we want and say, here, be happy with this. I'm sorry. No, we have to offer them what they want. We have to give them what they want. Now, that's also true when it comes to God. It's not the sinner who gets to tell God what I'm going to give you so that I can get back in your good graces. That's what Cain thought. Cain thought, look, I'm a farmer. This is what I work hard for this stuff. This is what I want to give you, God, in order to get back in your good graces. And God says, that's not what I want. And some people today do all kinds of religious activity, thinking that in doing this religious activity, they're getting right with God and that they're going to be acceptable to God because they're doing all this religious activity when God never told them to do the religious activity to get right with them. what God said to get right with them is you need to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ to have your sins forgiven. And then we worship him, and we might do, quote, what you might call religious activity because you already are in a right relationship with God. But we don't get to tell God what he wants. We don't get to give to God what it is that we're going to give him to make him right with us. We're not the ones that do that, or the ones that have that ability. Okay, that's not what we do. We're supposed to be the individuals who give them what it is that they want. So that's why you have this example here. So they asked the Gibeonites, what is it you want? And when they asked the Gibeonites what they want, they said, well, we don't want money. It's not about money. It's not about property. It's about the fact that they killed some of our families. So if you murder people, there needs to be a blood payment. And so they say, give us 7 sons of Saul. And so that's what's under consideration. For those of you that are just walking in, it's nice to see you. You will probably have a longer time than you expect because we started our regular Bible studies at 9:30 to 10:30, and then our worship service starts at 10:30. So you're here a little bit early, but we're glad you're here, and hopefully you can learn something. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 21. So if you want to open it to 2 Samuel 21, that's where we're at, and we're looking at this story with the Gibeonites. So they asked for 7 sons of Saul, and as they asked for these 7 sons of Saul in order to make atonement for them. The other thing I want you to notice is in 2 Samuel 21:3, it says, thus David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you, and how can I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? What's interesting is the Gibeonites weren't actually Israelites, were they? So in a sense, the Gibeonites weren't full-blooded Israelites, although they were treated as Israel. But what you notice is how they talk to God affects what God does with his people. Now, why am I telling you that? Because the way you treat a sinner, and whether you're kind or gracious to them, might affect your life. Because if you're mean and cruel and rough to them, and you don't help them when they're in need, they might pray to God and say, God, you know, that guy that you said was supposed to be one of your people, he doesn't help me. He doesn't care about me. And you might, as a result, have famine or problems in your life. That's one of the things I want you to remember. God doesn't expect us to do good just to one another. God expects us to do good to everybody. And especially with people you have a covenant with, people that you promise to take care of, people that you promise to help. All right, so I just wanted to point that out to you. And so they asked for 7 men. So they asked for 7 sons of Saul. Now, one of the things to remember also is that when one king becomes king, they generally exterminate the family of the other king that was before them. Why do they do that? Why, when one dynasty takes possession of a kingdom, do they remove the other dynasty? All right, so people in that family won't rebel against them, and maybe even the people follow them instead of following the real king, right? Okay, and so that's what we have going. That's what we have going on here. Now, as a result of that, Saul's family should have all really been killed. But David's kingdom is not like most people's kingdom. And by the way, you and I were enemies of Jesus. So when Jesus becomes king, what do kings usually do? They destroy their enemy, right? Well, instead, Jesus didn't destroy us. What did he do for us? He made a way for us to get right with him. He made a way for us to live with him. And that also required death in order for that to happen. So why am I telling you that? Well, because there's this guy named Mephibosheth, verse 7 says, but the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath of the Lord, which was between David and Saul's son Jonathan. So the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah and the daughter of Ai, Armani, and Mephibosheth, that's a different Mephibosheth, whom she had borne to Saul, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she had bore to Ariel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite. And then he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them. Now, Saul, what David basically did was he took the closest relatives that he could find of Saul. So he didn't take cousins that were 10 times removed. He tried to get the closest people to Saul's physical line. And so there was this guy named Mephibosheth, but David had made a promise with who? Jonathan, about Mephibosheth, remember? And that covenant was that David wasn't to destroy all of Jonathan's house. So he made that covenant. So again, we see the idea of a covenant and how that covenant needs to be kept. So though he's going to give him the 7 sons, he's not going to give him Jonathan because he has a covenant with Saul, and he needs to keep his covenant as he does that. And so there's a lot of covenant keeping in here that I hope you see. And so when God tells us in the New Testament that you're not to swear, he doesn't mean you can't make a covenant. And he doesn't mean you can't make a promise. What he means is you're not supposed to swear like the Jews swear. And that is they'll swear to you all day long. And then when it comes time to pay, they'll swear they never swore. Because they only counted certain swears as being authentic. And so David wants to spare Saul, or wants to spare Mephibosheth. So he takes these other sons and he gives them to the Gibeonites. Verse 9 says, and then he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them in the mountain before the Lord, so that the 7 of them fell together, and they were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, if you remember, the reason for them getting these 7 sons was because there had been a famine. And so when are they doing this? They're doing this right before the harvest. They want God's blessing. So this needs to be done before the harvest happens so that God can bless them with their harvest. And that's the reason they're doing it there. Now, I also want you to notice that this was done in the mountain before the Lord. So this wasn't something done out of vengeance. It wasn't something done out of spite. It wasn't something done out of hatred. It was a legal matter that had to be remedied. That's why it had to be done legally. That's why the Gibeonites said, we don't have the right to put anybody to death. It has to be done legally because this is a legal matter that's going on. And so that's what you have going on. So they were put to death during the time of the harvest time. Then verse 10 says, and Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, took sackcloth and spread it before herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until it rained on them from the sky. And she allowed neither the birds of the sky to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. And so basically the mother of these individuals, or one of the relatives of these 7 men that were killed, came, and they were hung on a rock. And remember that the reason you hang somebody on a rock, or you put somebody on a rock, is why? What are you doing? Jesus was hung on a cross. Why not just kill him in a hospital bed in a room somewhere? Because it was done for all to see. It was a public matter. That's why I'm telling you, it wasn't vengeance. It wasn't they're doing it out of spite or hatred. It was a public matter, and as a public matter, the punishment or the crime payment was displayed in public on this rock, and they were left there. Okay. And so this relative comes and she spreads, basically she puts down a little place for her to sit because she's going to stay there for a little bit of time. She stays there until it rains. What does that have to do with the story? The famine. The reason you have a famine is because there's no rain, especially in the land of Canaan. The way they watered their crops was by rain falling down, not like in Egypt where they watered them by irrigating from the Nile. They had to depend on God for rain. And so after they did this thing, God goes, okay. And he opens up the rain. And so everybody now recognizes God's accepted their judgment, the punishment for these crimes that were committed. And so as a result of that, she's out there in the field by day and by night. Now, verse 11 says, when it was told David what Rizpah, the daughter of Ai, the concubine of Saul, had done, then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, his son, from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the open square in Beth Shan, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines struck down Saul in Gilboa. So David finds out that this lady's there. Now, I find this interesting because this lady is a relative of the ones who were being killed as punishment for what the house of Saul did. And David has compassion on her. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. I believe it's called Amish Grace, I think. But if you remember a while back, some guy who had lost his child went into an Amish school and killed a bunch of the students. You remember that? Okay. One of the things you probably don't know is that the elders of that church, when it came time, because the policeman then killed that man who had done that. I can't remember if the policeman killed him or he killed himself. But anyway, when his funeral came, the elders of the church went to support his wife. And you might go, why would they do that? Because we're supposed to be gracious. This lady lost her family, even though it was a just crime that they committed. She lost her family. She's grieving. And David wants to help her. And that's the kind of people we're supposed to be. That's what Jesus says when he says you're supposed to love your neighbors. You're supposed to love your enemies. We don't want revenge on them. Once justice is done, we do whatever we can to be gracious to the people that are involved in it. And that's what you see David doing here. That's the reason this story's in here. This story's in here just to give you a story. This story's in here to get us to understand how gracious we're supposed to be and how kind we're supposed to be. It's the kind of people we're supposed to be. And I guarantee you, if we're that kind of people, people are going to want to come to us. But if we're judgmental and I'm right and you're wrong, and I'm going to heaven and you're not, and I'm glad you're not going to be there, then guess what? And so he took the bones, and even the bones of Saul that had been hidden. Verse 13 says, and he brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, his son, from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged, and they buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan, his son, in the country of Benjamin Zelah, in the grave of Kish, his father. And thus they did all that the king commanded. And after that, God was moved by prayer for the land. So the way we treat sinners and the way we treat people that we don't think are Christian might have a dire effect on us as a group of people. And so remember that. God doesn't want us just to love each other. God wants us to love everybody. And if you're holding a grudge against somebody, you better fix it. You better get it right. And that's also what Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. And so in verses 15, then we have this story about wars with the Philistines. And remember, I told you that this last section deals with an appendix. They're not in order, but it then tells us a war. And I'm just going to basically read some of this, not comment a lot on it, simply because we don't have enough time. Our time is almost up. And I at least wanted to cover more than I covered, but you know me and my mouth. Verse 15 says, now when the Philistines were at war again with Israel, and David went down and his servants with him, and as they fought against the Philistine, David became weary. Then Ishib-Benob, who was among the descendants of the giants, that's the Philistines, the weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight, was girded with a new sword, and he intended to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, helped him and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, you shall not go out again with us to battle, so that you do not extinguish the lamp of Israel. Now it came about after this that there was war again with the Philistines at Gob, and Shebbekai, the Hushathite, struck down Saph, who was among the descendants of the giants. And there was war with the Philistines again in Gob, and Elihanah, the son of Jerah, Orgim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath, the Gittite. Now, who do we know killed Goliath? David. In the book of Chronicles, they add or they don't add, but it's added in there. There's an addition that the brother of Goliath is who he killed. So apparently either they left off something or it didn't get written down properly, but he killed the brother of Goliath because Goliath was part of the giants. And so if you want to look at that, you can. And the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was war at Gath again, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he also had been born to the giants. When he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were born to the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. And so that's where we'll stop for today. And next week we'll pick up chapter 22. And like I said, if you guys would like to study something else besides the historical books, let me know and we'll be happy to do that. So let me go offline here and then we can do our thing.